The morning fog hung stubbornly over Flaxborough, drifting lazily along the cobbles and curling around the lamp-posts like a cautious visitor. A hint of sunlight tried its best to pierce the mist, though the town seemed reluctant to fully wake. In the high street, the bakery's brass-handled door swung open with a polite squeak, letting out a warm, yeasty breath that mingled curiously with the damp chill. Mrs. Tewkesbury, vigilant in her violet bonnet, fussed with her basket of primroses, occasionally straightening a leaning bloom with the careful precision of a tax inspector auditing an errant ledger. The Flaxborough Horticultural Society, a body whose significance exceeded its practical influence, had gathered at the rear of St. Swithin's Hall for the annual spring flower competition. The event's gravity, in the eyes of the participants, was absolute. One misjudged dahlia could tarnish a reputation for life. Mr. Gerald Crump, chairman and self-appointed arbiter of taste, leaned over a table, spectacles teetering precariously on the bridge of his nose. He wagged a finger at a particularly recalcitrant hydrangea, muttering about moral laxity in plants, though no one quite understood why the subject deserved such personal attention. Purbright, quietly observing from the back, took in these small theatrical gestures with an unassuming patience. He noted the crowd's half-whispered gossip, the way Mrs. Tewkesbury's brows twitched whenever a flower leaned too far in any direction, and the subtle hierarchy implied by who received a nod from Crump and who was ignored. It was at this delicate, almost ceremonial moment of floral critique that the incident occurred. Constable Farnham, a man of considerable conscientiousness but limited imagination, arrived ushering a tall, mud-smeared figure through the garden gate. The man's coat, once respectable, was now marked with streaks of brown, his boots were caked, and a faint shiver suggested either cold or fear. "Found him like that, sir?" Farnham said, voice strained with the weight of official procedure. "Outside the orchard gate. He won't speak, sir." The announcement rippled through the gathering with the subtle force of a mild gust. Mrs. Wainwright's hand shot to her mouth. The primroses trembled in Mrs. Tewkesbury's basket. Mr. Johnson, the baker, muttered something about the very idea of criminality in Flaxborough, as though the town's moral fibre were a personal possession. Purbright's gaze drifted over the figure with measured attention. The man's shoulders were rigid, his right hand trembled faintly, and his eyes darted not in panic, but in careful calculation, taking in each observer and registering their reactions with a caution that suggested a familiarity with scrutiny. Small details, almost laughable to an untrained eye, but not to Purbright. The angle of the collar, the damp patch at the elbow, the faintly uneven gait when Farnham guided him forward. Crump, regaining his composure, adjusted his spectacles with the air of a man reclaiming authority over both plants and circumstance. "How utterly preposterous," he declared. "Who would dare disturb the sanctity of our flower show? This is unprecedented." Mrs. Tewkesbury's gasps punctuated the accusation, while others exchanged glances heavy with speculation. The murmurs began, weaving a tapestry of possible explanations, a burglary gone awry, a lover's quarrel spilling over, or some inexplicable accident. In truth, the explanation was less dramatic than the audience hoped. Purbright, however, remained silent. He observed Farnham's unease as the constable attempted to explain the man's presence and reluctance to speak. Each pause, each forced smile, each hesitant word was carefully catalogued in the inspector's mind. Nothing was overt. The crime, or seeming crime, was as understated as the town itself, yet the potential for disruption was immense. A small, overlooked detail caught Purbright's attention, a faint smear of floral pollen along the man's coat lapel. It was insignificant, easily dismissible, yet oddly placed. Perhaps it had blown from the show, or perhaps it was a clue to a more subtle story. For now, it was merely a point of interest, a tiny irregularity in the otherwise orderly scene. As the crowd swelled with murmurs, conjectures, and the occasional indignant sniff, Purbright noted the social ballet around the incident, Crump attempting to regain control, Farnham struggling to maintain procedural propriety, and the townsfolk quietly assigning blame in whispers that carried more weight than any formal accusation. None of it required immediate action, yet the inspector's mind began its quiet weaving, connecting threads invisible to the casual observer. In the orchard beyond, the fog continued its lazy drift, wrapping the gate and the figure in a muted cocoon of uncertainty. Flaxborough had not yet recognized the significance of what had passed unnoticed in the mist, but Purbright, patient and polite as ever, began to sketch the outlines of the truth in his mind. The day's ordinary commotion, harmless on the surface, had already set in motion a series of minor disturbances that would ripple through the town with increasing subtlety and, perhaps, menace. No one spoke further, the flowers remained, the fog lingered, and Purbright, quietly observing, understood that this seemingly trivial moment might prove far less trivial than anyone suspected. The townsfolk would talk, speculate, and misinterpret, as they always did, while the truth waited, measured and patient, in the calm folds of the morning mist. By late morning, the news of the Orchard Gate incident had spread like a faint perfume of scandal, drifting into every corner of Flaxborough. In the tidy tea-rooms of Millstone Street, patrons whispered with the polite urgency of those who understood the importance of appearances. Mrs. Tewkesbury, still, clutching her basket of primroses, had been the first to relay the story, though she omitted no embellishment she considered socially appropriate. Mr. Johnson, the baker, nodded solemnly as he sipped his tea, muttering about the moral decay implied by mud-streaked strangers wandering into horticultural sanctuaries. The proprietor, Mrs. Larkspur, poured tea with mechanical precision, but her eyes flicked frequently toward the entrance, as if expecting more revelations to arrive on the morning's draught of gossip. Over the clatter of spoons against china, tales grew taller. One version suggested a theft, another implied a duel gone awry, and yet another claimed the stranger was a disgruntled horticultural rival seeking revenge. Purbright, passing quietly through the small throng, noted each speculation with mild interest. He did not interrupt, he did not clarify. He only observed the cadence of voices, the emphasis on scandal over truth, and the subtle hierarchy of those whose words carried the most weight. Several new faces emerged in conversation, adding layers to the story. Mr. Hemming, a retired magistrate with a taste for melodrama, insisted the man's presence indicated a deeper plot, perhaps a long-standing feud with the orchard's owner. Miss Claribel Tripp, perched primly in a corner, suggested the stranger might have been a lost traveller seeking shelter, though she couched the notion with nervous laughter, aware that charity in Flaxborough was often met with suspicion. Each voice contributed a piece of the town's moral puzzle, whether grounded in fact or imagination. Purbright's eyes lingered on a small gold thimble, barely noticeable on the table, which one of the ladies had inadvertently set beside her teacup. It was the sort of detail others dismissed, but he catalogued it quietly, noting its slight indentation and faint smudge of floral pollen. Such things, trivial in appearance, often carried significance in his experience. Outside the window, the orchard gate remained shrouded in fog, its presence a silent witness to the unfolding narrative. From this distance, no one could discern whether the stranger had been injured, frightened, or merely inconvenienced, yet speculation continued to inflate the incident into something far more consequential than it might truly have been. Meanwhile, Farnham's constabulary report had begun to circulate in hushed tones. The man was said to be uncooperative, yet there were murmurs that he had been seen speaking with the orchard keeper late the previous evening, though no one knew precisely what was said. Each retelling adjusted itself to fit the teller's perception, as is often the case in a town that measures life in gossip rather than records. Purbright, quietly noting every contradiction and hesitation, understood that the gossip itself was a form of evidence. It revealed character more than the events ever could, the town's fears, its petty rivalries, and its tendency to ascribe motive where none might exist. He observed the flourishes of indignation, the soft smiles of those who considered themselves morally superior, and the subtle glances exchanged between long-standing acquaintances who had their own minor grievances. By midday, a tentative consensus had formed, though consensus in Flaxborough was rarely anything but a temporary illusion. The stranger was at once a trespasser, a thief, a victim, and perhaps a local conspirator. Purbright allowed the conversation to flow around him, the threads of the story intertwining with the rhythms of ordinary life, until the afternoon light shifted, casting shadows that seemed to lengthen the gaps between each whispered theory. In the quiet corners of the tea-room, beneath the polite clinking of cups and the soft rustle of napkins, the seeds of suspicion had taken root. Purbright noted them with patient detachment, aware that the man at the orchard gate and the town's reaction to him would form the basis for a far more intricate understanding of motive, opportunity, and the subtle mechanics of Flaxborough society. Even now, as the town gossiped and theorized, the inspector's mind worked steadily, cataloguing every inconsistency, every hesitation, every small flourish of behavior that might later prove decisive. The incident, though outwardly minor, had begun to ripple through the town with quiet force, and Purbright, patient as ever, understood that the true story was only beginning to emerge from the fog. By mid-afternoon, Purbright had settled into the quiet rhythm of investigation, a methodical pace that often appeared to outsiders as leisurely but in fact concealed a precise and deliberate attention to detail. He began at the orchard itself, where the gate stood slightly ajar and the mud-tracked path suggested an unhurried exit. Constable Farnham hovered nervously, offering observations in halting fragments, while the orchard-keeper, Mr. Durnford, insisted he had seen nothing unusual the previous evening, though his hesitation betrayed a slight uncertainty. Purbright listened carefully, allowing Durnford to continue at length, noting the subtle twitch of his lips when he mentioned the stranger, the casual way he adjusted his sleeves, and the slight narrowing of his eyes whenever he referred to the orchard boundaries. These small, almost imperceptible movements spoke volumes to the inspector, though they might have passed unnoticed by those eager for a straightforward answer. Next, he visited the flower show judges, beginning with Miss Violetta Hargreaves, whose enthusiasm for the Primula competition had earned her both respect and mild exasperation from the more seasoned members. Miss Hargreaves insisted she had observed nothing suspicious, yet she remembered seeing a man, tall, unremarkable in manner, loitering near the orchard gate with an intensity she described as most curious. Purbright asked no pointed questions. He merely encouraged her to recount every detail, no matter how trivial. Each repetition revealed small inconsistencies, gestures, or overlooked observations that the inspector mentally filed away. He then spoke with Mrs. Wainwright, whose role as the town's unofficial arbiter of propriety gave her testimony a particular weight. She expressed concern for the stranger's condition, but Purbright detected a subtle tension in her tone when she spoke of the orchard-keeper. It was the sort of delicate implication common in Flaxborough, a hint at grievance without direct accusation, a remark layered in civility, yet carrying unspoken judgments. Footprints were examined next. Purbright crouched quietly beside the mud, noting the direction and depth, the weight distribution, and the odd scuff that suggested a hurried change in gait. He refrained from sharing these observations, preferring to compare them later with other evidence, for it was the pattern of human behavior he found most revealing, not the superficialities that might distract the casual observer. Each interview added a layer to the growing mosaic of the morning's events. Small details, the damp patch on the stranger's coat, the faint scent of hyacinth lingering on his collar, the uneven wear on his boots, were catalogued with meticulous care. Purbright noticed who spoke freely and who chose words with deliberate caution. The inspector's mind, patient and deliberate, began to trace connections invisible to the townsfolk, linking hesitations, gestures and tone into a network of subtle truths. By late afternoon, a tentative timeline began to emerge. The stranger had arrived at the orchard some time after dusk, according to conflicting but overlapping accounts. He had loitered near the gate, perhaps resting or observing, before encountering some minor difficulty that led to his present muddy state. No one reported overt aggression, no one witnessed theft or violence, yet the aura of unease persisted, amplified by gossip and personal anxieties. Purbright's final interviews included the gardener, Mr. Bellamy, who expressed mild irritation at the stranger's presence, complaining of trampling and disturbance of carefully tended borders. Purbright allowed the man to speak at length, noting the precise mixture of indignation and self-importance in his tone. He said little, yet mentally recorded Bellamy's tendency to exaggerate inconveniences, a trait that might later illuminate motives or reveal deception. As dusk approached, the inspector gathered his notes quietly, content to leave appearances undisturbed. The town, in its customary fashion, speculated, whispered and theorized, yet none of the accounts aligned perfectly with reality. Purbright, patient and observing, understood that truth lay not in dramatic revelation, but in these measured, sometimes contradictory, human responses. Each contradiction, each hesitation, each inadvertent disclosure would later become a critical piece of the puzzle, revealing what lay beneath Flaxborough's orderly surface. The following morning, Flaxborough awoke with the renewed sense that order had been subtly disturbed. Conversations in the market square and along the high street reflected the human tendency to seek the simplest solution, and almost immediately attention focused on Mr. Bellamy, the orchard's assistant gardener. His habitual irritability and recent complaints about disturbances in the flower beds made him an easy target. To many, he embodied the familiar pattern of motive, proximity, opportunity, and a temperament ill-suited to restraint. Purbright observed the subtle cascade of assumptions, noting how quickly neighbours and shopkeepers formed a consensus. Bellamy, for his part, was outwardly unconcerned, yet there was a faint twitch in his right eyebrow when questioned by Mr. Crump, who seemed determined to affirm his suspicion through polite interrogation. "I should think you were involved, Bellamy," Crump said with carefully modulated civility. "It is so very unusual for misfortune to visit without cause." The gardener protested in his characteristic monotone, insisting he had been tending the rose beds and saw nothing, but the protests were heard less as exculpation and more as confirmation of his own capacity for mischief. He wrung his hands in a habitually anxious gesture, and Purbright's eye noted the subtle tremor in his knuckles, a reaction perhaps to stress, perhaps to indignation, difficult to distinguish in a man accustomed to self-discipline. Purbright spoke sparingly, asking only neutral questions that invited narrative rather than confession. He requested Bellamy recount the previous evening in as much detail as possible, and the gardener complied with meticulous attention to minor tasks, all the while revealing inconsistencies, tiny discrepancies in timing, the order of tending to the plants, and the locations of his own footprints. To the casual observer, these were trivial. To Purbright, they were threads in the slowly forming tapestry of truth. Meanwhile, townsfolk gathered on the periphery, offering commentary with the confident air of jurors. Mrs. Wainwright murmured that she had always suspected something peculiar about Bellamy, while Mr. Johnson suggested the mud on the stranger's boots could only have come from someone intimately familiar with the orchard paths. Even the local baker, whose evidence was typically limited to supposition, felt compelled to contribute his observations with the authority of long-standing civic engagement. Yet Purbright remained attentive to subtler signals, a brief glance toward the orchard's back fence that lingered too long, the slight hesitation in a response about a missing spade, the way Bellamy's speech occasionally flagged as though rehearsed. Each small hesitation, each unnecessary qualification was catalogued not for dramatic confrontation, but for future comparison with the behavior of others in similar circumstances. By midday, a tentative narrative had begun to crystallize among the community. Bellamy, irritated by the disruption to his orderly work, had confronted the stranger, resulting in the muddied state witnessed at the gate. This neat explanation suited the desires of many to simplify and moralize, yet Purbright, ever patient, withheld judgment. He had seen the tendency of Flaxborough to embrace the obvious and ignore subtle contradictions, and he recognized that the most plausible suspect was often the least reliable guide to truth. Other minor details demanded attention. Bellamy's boots bore irregular wear, suggesting recent excursions beyond the orchard. His coat had faint traces of floral pollen inconsistent with his stated activities. Such minutiae, easily overlooked or misinterpreted by the townsfolk, provided Purbright with a quiet framework for subsequent observation. As the afternoon drew on, Purbright allowed the suspicion to hover around Bellamy without overt accusation, carefully monitoring responses from other residents who might interact with him. Each glance, each whispered comment, each polite question added depth to the picture, revealing the network of motivations, grudges, and civic pride that governed Flaxborough's subtle social mechanics. By evening, the town had largely accepted Bellamy as the primary suspect, though unease lingered at the edges of certainty. Purbright, however, recognized that certainty achieved too early was rarely trustworthy. He left the orchard with a composed manner, his mind cataloguing every minor discrepancy, aware that the next stage of inquiry would require patience, subtle testing, and the careful comparison of observed behavior against assumed narrative. In Flaxborough, the obvious answer was seldom the correct one, and the inspector understood that the town's readiness to convict might only deepen the eventual surprise. The next morning, Purbright returned to the orchard, choosing to arrive early while the town still lingered in the quiet deliberation of unfinished routines. The sun was weak but persistent, casting long, pale shadows across the gates and paths that had already become the center of curious speculation. Farnham was present, fussing over footprints and noting which paths the stranger had traversed, yet Purbright paid little heed to the obvious markings, focusing instead on subtler elements that might betray human habit rather than simple accident. It was a small, incongruous detail that caught his attention. A brass gardening label half buried in mud marked Primula Veris, slightly bent and out of place. At first glance, it might have seemed a trivial misplacement, easily overlooked by anyone but Purbright. Yet its position did not correspond with the surrounding arrangement, and the dirt on one corner suggested that it had been handled recently, not by the gardener, whose footprints were already mapped elsewhere. The inspector crouched quietly, noting the angle of the bent label and the faint traces of pollen, which did not match the flowers nearby. He allowed Farnham to continue his examination, listening politely as the constable enumerated the obvious findings. Each statement was a repetition of what the town already assumed, yet Purbright's mind worked silently, connecting the subtle irregularities to the sequence of events. The misplaced label suggested attention or distraction or even deliberate interference, Small gestures in Flaxborough could reveal more than hours of testimony. Later, he visited the tea rooms where Mrs. Wainwright had already become aware of the incident and contributed a fresh perspective. She mentioned, casually and with faint indignation, that she had noticed a visitor the previous week lingering by the orchard boundary, asking innocuous questions about planting schedules. Her tone implied nothing, but the fact remained. The stranger's presence might not have been entirely coincidental, and someone else in the town had seen him days before the mud-streaked encounter. Purbright listened, nodding politely while cataloguing her words. Such details, easily dismissed as idle chatter, often formed the skeleton of more complex truths. He noted the unspoken significance behind phrases, the subtle shifts in emphasis, and the quiet gaps in memory. Each omission was a clue, each emphasis a potential misdirection. Back at the orchard, he quietly re-examined the paths, comparing them with the footprints, the bent label, and the positions noted in previous visits. The pollen on the label, combined with the direction of the mud tracks, suggested the stranger had approached along a route deliberately chosen to avoid notice. It was not mere chance. There was intention behind the disorder. Purbright allowed the observation to sink quietly into his mind, careful not to draw premature conclusions. That afternoon he questioned Mr. Hemming, the retired magistrate, who recalled seeing a man matching the stranger's description loitering near the orchard gate during last week's market day. Hemming's account was casual, almost incidental, yet it confirmed the possibility of repeated presence, a subtle pattern otherwise invisible to those focused solely on immediate events. Even the minor town gossip provided insight. Miss Claribel Tripp, sipping her afternoon tea, remarked that she had noticed something unusual about the stranger's boots. The soles were of a design uncommon in Flaxborough, suggesting travel from outside the immediate district. Purbright noted the comment quietly, aware that small social observations, when corroborated, often revealed as much as direct interrogation. By evening, the inspector had collected a quiet accumulation of irregularities: the bent label, the pollen, the footprints, the observed prior presence, and the unusual footwear. Each on its own might appear inconsequential, yet together they formed an undercurrent of evidence, invisible to the casual eye. The town, meanwhile, continued its speculation, focusing largely on Bellamy and the supposed straightforward explanation, unaware that the small, odd details Purbright had noticed hinted at a more complex story, one that would only fully reveal itself in time. Purbright departed the orchard with a composed manner, noting the fog returning faintly along the perimeter, carrying with it the subtle promise of deeper revelations. The obvious suspect remained convenient, but the inspector, quietly patient, understood that it was often the trivial, overlooked and seemingly inconsequential that eventually illuminated the truth. By mid-morning, Purbright had moved beyond the orchard, intent on observing Flaxborough in its ordinary, unremarkable rhythms. The town, oblivious to his scrutiny, continued its daily routines with the quiet efficiency of long habit. Shopkeepers arranging goods with exacting care, children skipping along the cobbles, and housewives exchanging whispers that carried more weight than official proclamations. Purbright, patient as ever, understood that the ordinary often concealed the extraordinary, and he methodically expanded the circle of inquiry beyond the obvious. First, he visited the doctor, Dr. Coleridge, a man whose genial demeanour masked a keen attention to social nuance. Coleridge had noted the stranger's pallor and a faint abrasion along the wrist, which he described as minor yet indicative of some previous strain. Purbright listened, politely probing for details about the stranger's movements in town, the time of his arrival, and interactions with residents. Each answer was measured, careful, revealing hints of observation that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Next, he called upon Mrs. Prendergast, the widow of some local repute, known for her keen eye and tendency to note everything from the gossip of servants to the behaviour of tradesmen. She mentioned an odd visit by the stranger to her garden gate the week prior, his inquiries framed innocuously but strangely specific about the orchard's routines. Purbright recorded the observation without comment, understanding that such minor irregularities often connected threads invisible to those who looked only at events, not motives. In the market square, he encountered a small group of townspeople whose combined recollections added subtle complexity to the story. Mr. Fenton, a retired schoolmaster, recalled a brief argument near the bakery involving Bellamy and another man he did not know. Mrs. Hargrove, who ran the local haberdashery, had seen someone loitering near the orchard on the morning of the flower show, his posture unusually tense, shifting from foot to foot, as though measuring the social terrain. Even the most mundane interactions revealed nuance. Purbright noted the baker's wife hesitating over her words, her tone shifting when asked casually about strangers in town. He catalogued gestures as much as statements, a twitch of the hand, a subtle nod, the avoidance of direct eye contact. In Flaxborough, such small signals often carried more truth than confident assertions. Returning to the orchard briefly, he examined the gate from multiple angles, noting wear patterns and marks that suggested repeated handling inconsistent with Bellamy's usual routines. The bent brass label, the mud tracks and traces of pollen all fit together into a network of small anomalies that had begun to form a coherent, yet invisible pattern. Purbright refrained from drawing immediate conclusions, letting the observations settle into a mental framework for comparison. Later, he visited the town's minor officials, each with their own minor grievances and peculiarities. The council clerk mentioned disputes over the boundaries of the orchard, a subject of polite contention for months, while the local school teacher described observing the stranger lingering near the edge of the playground, curious in manner but careful not to attract notice. These accounts, seemingly trivial, allowed Purbright to trace movements, motives, and opportunities with a precision that mere physical evidence could never convey. By late afternoon, the inspector's circle of awareness had expanded to include the orchard, the tea rooms, the high street, and the edges of several residential streets. He catalogued not only the behaviour of the stranger, but also the responses of townspeople to one another, the unspoken hierarchies, the quiet judgments, and the subtle adjustments of tone and posture that governed Flaxborough life. The day ended as he returned to the orchard gate once more, now a locus of accumulated observations. The fog crept back along the path, softening edges and masking details. Yet in Purbright's mind the pattern was becoming clearer. Multiple presences, repeated observations, minor disagreements, and behavioural inconsistencies all suggested that the morning's incident was part of a broader, interconnected social web. Bellamy remained convenient, but the evidence, in its quiet accumulation, hinted at far more complexity. Purbright departed in the evening with a calm, measured pace, knowing the next stage of inquiry would require careful attention to emerging developments. The town, unaware of the subtle shifts in his awareness, continued its routines, gossiping and speculating as always, while he catalogued the full spectrum of small human behaviours that would eventually illuminate the truth. A week had passed since the stranger had first been found at the orchard gate, and Flaxborough had settled into its usual rhythm of polite curiosity and speculative chatter. Yet early one misted morning, a fresh disruption rippled through the town. Mr. Crump, flustered and nearly out of breath, arrived at the market square to report that the orchard's new fence panel, recently installed to reinforce the boundary, had been torn from its hinges. The damage was minor, easily repairable, yet its presence introduced a new layer of complexity. Constable Farnham, arriving shortly after, confirmed the physical evidence. The timber bore fresh marks of impact, the hinges had been twisted, and mud at the base suggested hurried foot traffic. The town quickly began assembling narratives. Some suspected the stranger had returned, perhaps in an act of mischief or defiance. Others imagined a more mundane cause, an errant horse, a careless labourer. Theories were voiced with fervour, though none were supported by direct observation. Purbright, arriving quietly, noted the collective gaze of townsfolk upon the scene. He observed the gardener, Bellamy, whose expression betrayed an unexpected blend of indignation and subtle relief, as though the incident might shift suspicion elsewhere without implicating him. Each movement, each glance, each soft murmur was catalogued with meticulous attention. He crouched beside the disturbed earth, noting patterns in the mud and the unusual arrangement of leaves near the base of the panel. It was all precise, silent information that only he fully appreciated. The inspector then spoke with Mrs. Wainwright, whose morning walk had brought her to the orchard. She described seeing a figure in the early light, moving with careful attention along the perimeter, though fog had obscured distinguishing features. The timing matched the hour when no other witnesses had been present, and while she expressed uncertainty, Purbright sensed a faint tension beneath her words. Her choice of phrasing implied recognition, yet not confirmation, a subtle clue in the manner Flaxborough's residents often delivered truths indirectly. Returning to the orchard itself, Purbright examined the gate and fence for the second time that week. He noticed a fragment of a boot sole partially embedded in mud, distinct from Bellamy's known footwear. Its tread suggested a recent visitor, careful in approach, yet quick in departure. A faint pollen smudge on the timber matched the flower show's primulas, a pattern that seemed coincidental at first, but hinted at a deliberate path taken to avoid notice. News of the incident spread quickly through the town, invigorating the gossip mill. In the tea rooms, patrons debated the possibilities with animated seriousness. Mr. Johnson, the baker, insisted that the stranger could not have arrived unnoticed and therefore must have had an accomplice. Mrs. Tewkesbury, clutching her basket, expressed moral outrage at the audacity of trespass, while Miss Tripp suggested it was a deliberate attempt to unsettle Bellamy, whom the town had conveniently identified as the previous suspect. Each opinion layered itself atop the last, creating a complex lattice of conjecture that, in Purbright's mind, formed the social context necessary for understanding motive. By afternoon, subtle contradictions began to emerge. Bellamy insisted he had been tending roses at the far end of the orchard, yet the disturbed fence panel suggested proximity and opportunity. Other residents, eager to confirm their own assumptions, repeated observations that only partially aligned with facts. Purbright catalogued these inconsistencies carefully, recognizing that the truth would emerge not from overt confession, but from the quiet, often contradictory actions of those involved. As the day wore on, it became evident that the first suspect was less certain than the town had believed. The new damage and supporting observations hinted at additional presences, complex motives, and human behavior that was far from straightforward. The inspector, patient and methodical, allowed the speculation to flourish around him, while mentally tracing the patterns of movement, opportunity, and social subtlety. By evening, the orchard gate stood partially repaired, the town buzzing with theories, yet the stranger remained silent, and Bellamy retained a semblance of innocence in public perception. Purbright walked slowly back along the cobbled streets, noting the layering of evidence, the interplay of gossip, and the delicate emergence of behavior that, though minor, would ultimately illuminate the true sequence of events. In Flaxborough, the ordinary was rarely simple, and the second incident had quietly shifted the balance, expanding both suspicion and complexity in ways only the inspector fully appreciated. That evening, after the town had returned to its accustomed rhythms of polite routine, Purbright retreated to the quiet of his study, a small room at the back of the station overlooking the gently sloping rooftops of Flaxborough. The fading light fell softly across stacks of notes, scattered witness statements, and the meticulous sketches of footprints and garden paths he had made over the past week. Alone, he allowed himself the luxury of reflection, tracing the sequence of events in his mind and examining the behaviors that had accompanied each development. He considered the first incident at the orchard gate. The stranger, outwardly simple in appearance, had revealed little through words, but much through posture, hesitation, and minute gestures. The mud on his boots, the slight tremor of his hand, and the angle of his gaze when first confronted were all silent statements of experience, of calculation, or perhaps anxiety. Purbright noted how townspeople had immediately filled the gaps with their assumptions, projecting motives and character traits onto someone they had seen for only a moment. The second incident, the damaged fence panel, had further complicated matters. It was tempting to attribute it to mischief, or to the first suspect, Bellamy, but Purbright understood the danger of accepting such convenient conclusions. He thought of human behavior as layered and often contradictory, a series of gestures and reactions that required careful comparison over time. The subtle shift in Bellamy's expression when the fence was discovered, the precise manner in which he discussed his movements, and the nervous attention to detail in minor explanations, all of it contributed to a picture that was far from complete, but growing more coherent. Purbright reflected also on the townsfolk themselves. Their gossip, though trivial in appearance, was a lens into their own motivations and anxieties. Mrs. Wainwright's phrasing, Miss Tripp's hesitations, and Mr. Hemming's casual recollections all contained cues about credibility, social hierarchy, and hidden grudges. It was not merely the stranger or the fence that mattered. It was the way the community processed, interpreted, and misinterpreted events. Understanding human nature, Purbright knew, was often more revealing than examining physical evidence alone. He thought of the bent brass label found at the orchard, the pollen mismatched to surrounding flowers, and the boot fragment partially embedded in mud. Each trivial element, initially overlooked, had become a thread that might connect separate moments and people into a coherent whole. The challenge lay in resisting the impulse to impose a simple narrative prematurely. Truth, Purbright knew, revealed itself only through careful observation and patient deduction. The inspector's mind also lingered on the inconsistencies in the accounts he had gathered. Small variations in timing, tone, and emphasis suggested that the simplest stories often concealed subtle deviations from fact. He compared the gestures of Bellamy, the orchard keeper, and the stranger against these minor contradictions, noting the tension that arose from socially conditioned politeness. In Flaxborough, civility could disguise motive as effectively as deception, and awareness of this distinction was crucial. Purbright sipped his tea slowly, observing how the last light of day softened the edges of rooftops and chimneys, blending them into a muted canvas. He allowed himself a quiet acknowledgement of the subtle humor in human behavior, the exaggerations, the misinterpretations, the unconscious posturing, that so often provided insight without any awareness on the part of the actors. Even in tension, the town retained its ordinary rhythms, yet these ordinary details were precisely what would illuminate truth. By the time darkness settled fully, Purbright's reflections had drawn a loose map in his mind, sequences of movement, small interactions, contradictions, and behavioral patterns. He understood that while Bellamy remained the convenient suspect for the town, the evidence, subtle and interwoven, suggested a broader web of actions and motives. Patience, observation, and carefully staged inquiry would be required before certainty could be achieved. As he put away his notes for the night, Purbright allowed himself a quiet satisfaction. The pieces of the puzzle were assembling themselves, quietly and without fanfare, guided by human behavior rather than dramatic gestures. The town slept, unaware of the inspector's methodical attention, while in his mind the story was gradually revealing its contours, each small reflection sharpening the focus of what would eventually become undeniable clarity. Early on a mild morning, Purbright arranged a seemingly casual visit to the orchard, framing it as an inspection of the flower beds and recently repaired fence. The town, accustomed to his methodical routines, observed without suspicion, assuming the day would pass as any other. Bellamy was present, performing minor tasks with habitual precision, unaware that the inspector's quiet scrutiny carried a purpose far more deliberate than mere oversight. Purbright began by discussing minor horticultural matters, commenting politely on the roses and primulas, steering the conversation toward the sequence of events surrounding the first incident. His questions were careful, indirect, designed not to alarm, but to encourage narrative. He asked about the condition of the fence, the growth patterns of certain flowers, and the timing of Bellamy's work the previous week. Each inquiry was phrased in a neutral tone, yet its underlying intent was clear to Purbright, to provoke a response that might reveal subtle contradictions or discomfort. Bellamy responded dutifully, describing each activity with meticulous attention, yet occasionally pausing before specifying details of movement near the orchard gate. His hesitations were brief but noticeable, subtle cracks in an otherwise composed account. Purbright allowed them to linger, providing no guidance, no correction, merely observing the rhythm of speech, the tension in posture, and the careful attention to phrasing. The inspector then introduced an incidental remark, mentioning casually that someone had noted a distinct mud pattern on a panel of the fence, a pattern inconsistent with normal handling. Bellamy's eyes flicked momentarily to the disturbed timber, a micro-expression betraying a flicker of awareness he could not immediately mask. Purbright said nothing further, allowing the silence to carry its own weight. Next, he guided conversation toward minor town observations, referencing Mrs. Wainwright's and Miss Tripp's reports of a figure seen near the orchard in previous days. He spoke lightly as though recounting gossip, but in truth, each word was calibrated to test reactions. Bellamy's posture shifted subtly. He straightened, adjusted his gloves, and repeated statements he had given earlier, with slight, unconscious modifications. Purbright noted every nuance, aware that the combination of stress, repetition, and polite civility often revealed more than direct questioning ever could. At one point, the inspector mentioned the bent brass label, holding it delicately as he recounted its position at the time it had been discovered. Bellamy's hands twitched slightly, betraying minor irritation or unease, a fleeting signal that the detail mattered to him more than he wished to reveal. Purbright, ever patient, simply observed, noting the alignment between micro-behaviors and previously collected inconsistencies. A few neighbors, drawn by the early morning bustle, lingered at the edges of the orchard, commenting lightly on flowers, the repaired fence, and minor civic improvements. Purbright allowed their presence to form a natural social backdrop, understanding that the reactions of the accused in public, even among ordinary observers, often conveyed more than controlled interrogation in private. Bellamy's careful civility masked unease, and Purbright catalogued each glance, pause, and adjustment as part of the ongoing pattern of behavior. By midday, it became apparent that the polite, indirect questioning was producing the intended effect. Bellamy exhibited subtle signs of discomfort, repeated phrases unnecessarily, and occasionally overemphasized points he had previously stated without comment. Purbright allowed these signals to accumulate, silent but deliberate, aware that the interplay of observation, suggestion, and social setting was now revealing the contours of truth. The inspector concluded his visit with courteous thanks, making no direct accusations and leaving the orchard appearing as routine as it had at the outset. Bellamy resumed his work, visibly attempting to re-establish composure, unaware that the inspector's quiet methods had already begun to unsettle him. Purbright walked away slowly, noting the rhythm of the town and the careful orchestration of human behavior that, if traced correctly, would point unerringly toward the eventual revelation. By the evening, the evidence, indirect and behavioral, had begun to coalesce in Purbright's mind. He understood that the test, so subtle and civil, had elicited micro-reactions that exposed hidden discomfort, contradictions, and a faintly guilty alignment of gestures and speech. The town, oblivious to these minor signals, continued its routine, while Purbright quietly prepared for the final phase of inquiry, confident that patience and observation would soon illuminate the full truth. It was a calm afternoon when Purbright summoned the key figures to the drawing-room of St. Swithin's Hall, the same hall that had hosted the flower show. The sunlight fell softly through the tall windows, highlighting the muted tones of carpet and wood panelling. The room was quiet, save for the distant chatter of townsfolk attending to ordinary errands. Bellamy, the orchard assistant, sat with careful posture, joined by Mr. Durnford, Mrs. Wainwright, and Miss Tripp, each settling into chairs with polite curiosity. No one spoke until Purbright cleared his throat, and the hush that followed carried a weight that only civility could lend. "I have observed," Purbright began, his voice measured, courteous, and unhurried, "that small incidents, which seem trivial at first, often reveal more about human behavior than one might assume." He gestured to the bent brass label, now resting on the side table. "Take this, for instance. Its position, partially concealed in mud, suggested care in placement. The pollen on it, inconsistent with nearby flowers, indicates it was moved deliberately." He paused, allowing each person to register the observation. "The footprints near the orchard gate, and later by the damaged fence, do not correspond solely with Mr. Bellamy's regular path. They suggest a presence attempting discretion, careful, yet anxious, characteristics noticed only by those trained to observe without bias." Bellamy shifted slightly, a flicker of unease crossing his features. Purbright's gaze rested on him, calm but precise. "You were the convenient suspect, Mr. Bellamy, yet your movements, posture, and testimony indicated nothing more than a man performing his duties with diligence. The convenience of your apparent guilt was a social assumption, not a fact." He turned next to Mrs. Wainwright and Miss Tripp. "Observations from the past week indicate that a stranger, arriving days before the flower show, had been noted lingering near the orchard. Repeated sightings, coupled with the mud-streaked encounter and later disturbance to the fence, point to intentional, though unremarkable, activity by someone outside our immediate circle." Purbright allowed a pause. He observed the subtle reactions, Mrs. Wainwright's gentle raising of her brows, Miss Tripp's clasping of her hands, Mr. Durnford's quiet frown. Each micro-expression confirmed that the town had begun to perceive the difference between assumption and truth. "The individual," he continued, "acted with caution, avoiding notice but not with malice. The torn fence panel was not the product of anger, nor was the mud a mark of aggression. Rather, it was a consequence of navigating unfamiliar terrain under observation in a manner calculated to avoid confrontation." He drew a small diagram of the orchard paths on a notepad, showing the flow of movement over time. "The path taken aligns precisely with the footprint patterns, the position of the bent label, and the traces of pollen. These are not conjecture, they are patterns in human behavior, subtle yet reliable." Bellamy exhaled, tension easing as recognition dawned. Purbright's eyes moved to the stranger seated quietly in the corner, who now revealed the faintest acknowledgement of relief. "Your presence was noted days prior, which accounts for observations of loitering. Your reluctance to speak initially suggested reticence rather than guilt. In short, you were not the source of disruption, merely an unwitting catalyst for social speculation. He concluded gently. Flaxborough, as always, responded predictably, embracing the obvious and ignoring subtler cues. Yet the truth emerges through careful observation, patience, and the quiet analysis of behavior. There is no crime, no malice, only a series of small events that, amplified by gossip and assumption, appeared more significant than they truly were. A faint murmur of relief passed through the assembled, the tension dissipating like fog under the morning sun. Bellamy straightened fully, his composure restored. The stranger allowed a subtle smile, and Mrs. Wainwright relaxed her posture, acknowledging the clarity now presented. Miss Tripp, ever cautious, inclined her head in quiet recognition of the inspector's methodical approach. Purbright collected his notes and looked at each person in turn. The town may continue to discuss these events, as is customary, but let this serve as a reminder: appearances can mislead, assumptions can misguide, yet patient attention to the ordinary will reveal the extraordinary in its own time. The sunlight shifted slightly through the windows, touching the edge of the bent label and the diagram of footprints, and the room, once tense, settled into a quiet civility. No further explanations were necessary. The truth, understated and entirely human, had been revealed. Flaxborough, at least for the moment, could resume its ordinary life, reassured that the disturbance was minor and the lessons subtle but lasting. In the days following Purbright's calm resolution, Flaxborough resumed its accustomed rhythm with the measured steadiness of a town accustomed to minor disturbances. Shopkeepers arranged their wares with habitual precision, the church bells chimed at their usual intervals, and the cobbled streets echoed with the regular cadence of footsteps and gossip. Yet beneath the ordinary routines, subtle changes lingered, traces of the recent events woven quietly into the social fabric. Bellamy returned to his tasks in the orchard, tending roses and primulas with renewed diligence, though he carried a slightly lighter air, freed from the unwarranted suspicion that had shadowed him. The garden paths, once scrutinized with tension, now felt simply part of daily labor, and the bent brass label had been reset in its proper place, a small but deliberate act of restoration. The fence, fully repaired, bore no evidence of malice, only the faint imprint of events remembered by those attuned to subtle irregularities. Mrs. Wainwright and Miss Tripp resumed their morning walks and tea-room visits, their observations tinged with a quiet awareness of the town's propensity to assume the obvious. Conversations continued, but the speculative fervour had softened into polite curiosity, tempered by the reassurance of Purbright's methodical clarity. The lesson of observation, patience, and small detail, though largely unspoken, had permeated the town's collective consciousness in a subtle, almost imperceptible manner. Purbright himself returned to the station, a quiet figure amidst his neatly ordered papers. He catalogued reports, compared notes, and traced behavioral patterns with the same meticulous care that had guided him through the orchard and drawing-room. Each minor observation, each subtle reaction had been preserved, forming a mental archive that would serve not only as record, but as a framework for understanding the human nature that repeatedly shaped Flaxborough's minor dramas. The stranger, whose presence had precipitated the small upheaval, departed quietly, leaving behind only faint traces of footprints and a lingering curiosity among those who had encountered him. His interactions, cautious and deliberate, had proven entirely benign, yet the town would continue to reference him in hushed anecdote, a reminder of how minor events could spark disproportionate speculation. In the market square, life flowed uninterrupted, though the recent incidents had left their imprint in gestures and habits. Shopkeepers glanced at corners more carefully, Children noted the layout of garden paths with heightened awareness, and neighbours exchanged subtle, knowing glances when mentioning the orchard. The town's social machinery, refined over generations, had absorbed the disturbance, integrating it into the ordinary, where it would serve as a quiet testament to the value of observation and patience. Purbright, sitting at his desk, reflected on the intricate interplay of human behaviour he had witnessed. Civility, politeness, and the unconscious cues of speech and posture had revealed more than the apparent evidence of mud, footprints, or bent labels. It was a reminder that in Flaxborough, as elsewhere, truth often resided not in dramatic gestures, but in the quiet, consistent, and subtle patterns of human conduct. As evening settled, the inspector prepared his final notes, filing each observation with careful precision. The town outside his window had returned to routine, its streets bathed in the soft glow of lamps and the lingering warmth of daylight. Yet Purbright knew that beneath the surface, social dynamics had subtly shifted. Suspicion had been redirected, habits subtly adjusted, and the town had been reminded, without fanfare, of the value of attentive observation. By nightfall, the high street was quiet, the distant chiming of the church clock marking the passage of another ordinary day. Purbright, satisfied that the events had reached their natural conclusion, allowed himself a rare moment of repose. The mystery, understated and entirely human, had been resolved without disruption to the town's essential order. He set aside his pen, the accumulated notes now resting in perfect arrangement, and gazed through the window at the tranquil streets of Flaxborough. Ordinary life, resumed with subtle alterations, flowed onward, leaving only the faintest imprint of the past week's minor disturbances.